program is part of the Scene Project's podcast network. The Scene Project features interviews with independent musicians, comedians, and artists from across the Midwest. Become part of our community and support local art wherever you are. Welcome into another exciting episode of Real Biz. I'm your host, Bubba Startz, and with me today is sports psychologist and life coach, Dr. Brett Denkin. Dr. Brett, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bubba. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you in here. Obviously, a mutual friend and business partner of yours, I guess.
Yeah, she's talented.
Yeah, well, and she's obviously big in the music world as well. And I know that you're, in a little bit different field that overlaps with what we do here at the Scene Projects. We have the Scene Project Sports Network as well.
Nice.
But yeah,
Nice.
love what you do on the backside of these athletes and high-level business operators. And really, we're trying to teach artists in our collective as well how important their mental health is to them too. So really looking forward to our conversation today. Before we get too far into everything, just wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit of your backstory with us, and we'll kind of pick the conversation up from there.
Well, I grew up in Connecticut. I went to Emory University in Atlanta. I was a double major, economics and psychology. I worked in business for a few years, and I wanted to do something. I've always been sort of wired to make a difference. So even though I love the business world and I love trading, I love all these different aspects of entrepreneurship, I went out to San Diego to get a doctorate in the early 90s in psychology. And then I was doing a residency and they cut the residencies and I wound up back in Connecticut. And so I did a decade there. And then at 40, I unhooked my life. At the time, it felt like a huge deal, like to travel into the relative unknown, but it was out throughout the United States. So I put my business on the phone, did phone and FaceTime 20 years ago, basically before the whole COVID and telemedicine thing and all that stuff. And so I really turned myself into a life coach, sports psychologist over time. I'm an identical twin. We were really super athletic, really good at most sports, but had no size. And so the sports psychology is a tremendous fit for my personality and my style because a lot of the athletes that I work with and a lot of the entrepreneurs I work with today, they have a really high commitment to excellence. And I've always been a little bit driven, but also driven to make a difference. And the sports are absolutely fascinating to me. And at this stage, I work with a lot of D1 and pro athletes, so it's super fun.
Yeah, really cool stuff. So my dad was an athlete, a scholarship, and actually played against Emory a lot. He went to the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. That's actually where I was born. So not too far up the road from Atlanta. And, him being an athlete, I grew up playing a lot of sports in my career. Obviously didn't have, I grew up in a small town, so you're almost forced to play because they need numbers, but
Definitely.
Always enjoyed sports. And for me, music, which is something else that, my dad and my family kind of did. Dad played guitar, uncle played guitar, and, music just kind of became more a part of my life than the sports, but I'm still a massive sports fan. I think
Awesome.
I relate to a lot of that. And I mentioned my friend Brandon Day, who we had an interview with recently, who came from sports, was a D2 national champion, and ended up on the cover of Sports Illustrated of all things, 10 years ago or so, but has now picked up music. So talking to him about, like flow state and this, this mental space that we get in as high level performers, that it's very relatable across.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely 100%.
And you've taken that obviously to the business world as well. So it kind of, do you feel like you work with, obviously everyone is different. Every person is different, but that's the psychology of being a high level business person or a high level athlete, that a lot of the mental aspects of it are very, very similar.
Well, it doesn't matter what the sport I coach is, I mean, like, I've got a lot of soccer players, a lot of hockey players, a lot of baseball players, and some football players, and so on. But I've coached like Olympic runners and fencers and, sports that some of us would consider a little bit odd. In fencing, it's called the strip, right? And if you don't know fencing, I didn't grow up with anything like that. We just did baseball and tennis more or less, and, played like tackle football until somebody got hurt, that kind of thing, right? So it really, my basic philosophy is off the field for on the field and vice versa. So I'm doing the communication skills, the relationships, and then, of course, all the mental game training. And it can be with business people as well, because meditation, mindfulness, visualization, breath work, positive self talk, and what I call enhanced communication skills, living and speaking your truth. That pretty much could fit everyone. It's just sometimes the housewives don't take me up on it, so I'd rather go with the D1 or pro athlete.
Well, and you talk to who is listening to you, right? Being someone who came from the sports world, that you relate to them. And with as much advice as there is out on the internet now, people want to feel like they're seen and heard. And that's one thing that I, have found working in the music space is, we're all out here creating this art or, performing on the sports field, but don't necessarily always feel seen as human beings and felt in that way. And I think that's important for really anyone. Like you said, people
Well, you
tend to
spend a
find
lot
you.
of time, yeah, totally. You spend a lot of time in my world, really connecting and building relationships with people. And then playfully, I say, I have to get on a step ladder and smash them in the face. And because the reason the step ladder exists is because, I used to be 5'9". I'm probably clinging to 5'7.5", at close to 60 here. But these kids, a lot of them are 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", that I guide. And so that's my playful metaphor about climbing on the step ladder and literally, like saying it pretty straight, getting them to do things that they wouldn't necessarily do, like train their mind for real. Because unless you have a martial arts background or something like that, the vast majority of people, Bubba, aren't learning this in school. They're not learning this from their families. They're not learning how to train their minds pretty much anywhere.
No, and I think when most of us think of like psychology, and that we're thinking like from us to another, like we're playing games on somebody else and getting into their head, but really it's more about getting into your own head, being able to, wire and rewire certain things that you've learned to become that high level performer. And I assume for a lot of D1 athletes that you got to that level because you were the best person in your area and in your space. And now you're coming into a level where everybody was the best in their thing. And I imagine that
Totally.
there starts to become a lot of the imposter syndrome, and a lot of doubt starts to creep in to these young athletes who have never had that before. They've always been the best in their town, on their team, in their state, possibly. And now you're stepping into a much larger pool of professional or, amateur athlete.
Yeah, that's really well said. And, occasionally there are some exceptions. I'm watching a little bit of the Australian Open, the Grand Slam championships in tennis. There's only four of them, right? And Jessica Pagula, whose father is the billionaire owner of the Buffalo Bills, her interview is really fascinating because it took her a while longer to kind of get into her prime. Most of these female tennis players are there by 17, 18, 19, 20, and it took her longer to get inside the top 100 in the world, and then top 20 in the world, and top 10, and so on. But for the most part, you're dead right. These kids are, the D1s tend to be bigger, stronger, faster, but that's not enough if they don't really learn how to train their minds, unless they're Lawrence Taylor or something, or Michael Jordan, right? Unless they're so freaking gifted, someone else is going to have the edge. And that's why it's a lot of fun, because especially people that are a little bit more competitive are willing to do whatever it takes. And in my world, that means the mental game.
Yeah, and famously, Michael Jordan cut from his, high school basketball team, and facing those
Right, but
adversities.
he was going there, bigger, stronger, faster, more talented. I know that
More
story about how
driven.
him been cut, more driven or whatever. He was getting there one way or another, more or less. I mean,
Yeah.
so he's an
Well,
outlier example, I
yeah,
think.
but that's the
Right. Yeah.
psychology of it. And I think
Yeah.
for someone who, is, especially, I live in South Dakota, Dr. Brett. So
Yeah,
we live in a very
I'm
small.
aware of that. I saw one of your like interviews or whatever. You're in the middle of nowhere, a town of 1,000 people. And by the way, like my memory of South Dakota real quick is like when I was 25, my twin brother and I drove cross country, from Connecticut to San Diego where we went to grad school, and we got into a wicked fist fight in the Badlands of South Dakota. So I still remember South Dakota well.
Yeah, that's nice. Really, really beaten into you.
For sure. Those were bloody fights. We're identical twins, you know what I mean? So we've had many of them.
Oh, that's great. So, and yeah, what I was
Yeah.
alluding to is that even
Yeah.
in South Dakota, if you're, 6'8", 6'9", you're going to stand out among these high school athletes here. And
Right.
even if you go to when you step from that high school where you're probably one of the best players in the state, just because of your size, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to step onto a D1 basketball team and to be the best player on that team. And I think that it's almost more necessary to be extra driven. If you really want to do these sports and to play at a top collegiate level and then possibly move on to a professional level, depending on the sport that you're playing, it takes so much work, and
Yeah.
you have to want to be the best. It doesn't just happen.
No, it definitely doesn't. And again, a huge component of it is training the mind, and that does separate people, the people that are mentally tougher. And some of them, I always say playfully that maybe Derek Jeter and Tiger Woods came out of the womb, clutch, but for the most part, you don't really get there with a lot of trial and with a lot of practice and a lot of mental game training. Combination of putting yourself in position, being there often, and then of course the nonstop training the mind so that you can handle the pressure better. And then maybe there are some exceptions, people that are just coming out of the womb, gifted, or coming out of the womb, more poised, but again, they're doing the training as well.
Yeah, that clutch gene, right? And I don't know,
Exactly.
do you believe that it can be learned and it can be taught to put yourself in these? And how do you train your mind
Well, I
to
wouldn't have a
excel in
job,
those
right?
stressful
Like, I wouldn't have a
situations?
job if I didn't believe it was possible to train your freaking mind here, right? So, I'd be out of business quick, right? If it was just genetics, right? But yeah, so obviously, I believe that quite a bit. Just the process and the journey can be a little bit of a beast. I often say it's like 6 to 18 months to really set up the foundation. So what I'm doing when I'm coaching and guiding and mentoring is I'm pushing the kids to do the fundamentals, again, the meditation, the mindfulness practice, the visualization, the breath work, the positive self-talk, and again, like living and speaking your truth, because it develops so much courage when you're able to say it straight, right? But that is a build out. The mental game is a build out. It really is. And it doesn't happen overnight for most people, although some are going to take to it sooner than others. So if you do have like a martial arts background or something like that, it's going to come a lot quicker, or it might even be there. And then the reason that you're coming to someone like me is you want to take your game to the next level, as opposed to kids that have the yips, or kids that, perform well, in practice, but don't perform well in a game. See it?
Yeah, and have you, I guess, ever encountered, situations, and I know you've worked in this field for a long time, where it just doesn't take with someone for whatever reason? Like, are there situations where it just no matter how, maybe they're not working the program correctly and they're not actually doing the things, that it just doesn't work for people? Or do you believe that every single person has that ability to achieve that greatness?
Well, I mean, like, I'm not one of these sort of trophy types, everybody deserves a trophy. I mean, some people are more gifted than others. The reason, one of the separations between a D1 and a D3 is bigger, stronger, faster, right? Now, is there a mental game separation as well? Yeah, I've worked with military and, special forces dudes and so on. And there are differences. Some people are going to be more tenacious by nature, more conscientious by nature, more motivated by nature. But the nurture piece is important too, right? The conditioning, how you were raised, your attitude. I'm not for everybody. Some people, they don't want to train their freaking minds, or they're not ready, or they want to take, some people, often, antidepressants and drugs like that, most of the time they're not necessary. They really aren't. 80, 90% of the time they're not necessary, but people take them because it's a freaking shortcut, right? Now, there are obviously instances where, the depression gets so thick that it is necessary. It's running so ridiculously genetic. But for the most part, if you train your mind and you pay attention to your actions and you build healthy relationships and so on, you'll probably never need something like that.
Not everyone can handle getting punched in the mouth, step ladder or not.
It's a playful metaphor, but I am pretty tough at times. But again, you're building a lot of, again, it's a really extraordinary, I like to say it playfully as a male, but it takes an insane amount of patience that's not always natural to us to build the foundation so that you could be pretty assertive or even aggressive about asking somebody to make a freaking change, right?
Well, and
Because
like you said,
people resist change.
right. Well, and like you said, it's a build out, a 6 to 18 month build out to really get someone to change their mental habits, right? Along with maybe some physical habits inside of that as well, to build that out to be more confident, right? It doesn't happen overnight. You don't go to, 1 or 2 sessions with Dr. Brett and all of a sudden you're knocking down the last second shot with, with ice in your veins, right? Like it takes
Most of
that
the time,
building.
no, but every once in a while, I get a kid with the yips, and I tell the parents all the time, I'm like, this could be a while with the yips, but every once in a while, like 3 or 4 sessions, and the yips are gone. So it really, most of the time, that's absolutely the case. It's a build out, but every once in a while, someone just, I don't know, they just need a little tweaking, right? But for the most part, that's just not. I'm a relationship guy. I'm a long term thinker. I'm just not a short term guy. So I'm doing a lot of mentoring and guiding, and again, some of it's business coaching and life coaching and relationships and communication. So the build out is across the board. It really isn't in one area, especially when you think about a pro athlete. The moving parts of that are ferocious. The business aspect of being a pro athlete is really challenging. I mean, it is such a freaking business. It's crazy. And no matter how much the team seems to like you or the organization seems to like you, if you get hurt or injured, unless you're Tom Brady, you're expendable, right? You know what I mean? Unless you're at the very, very top, what I mean, your security is fragile.
Right, and we, not to mention the outside noise of the media and the fans and everything else that goes along with it. We very rarely stop to think about the life of a professional athlete and the stress that comes from that to keeping your job. I think a lot of us as fans, we see the big paychecks and the fact that they're getting paid to play a game, albeit, football's a very hard game to play through, but we very rarely see through that and see to the people that are inside of that. And I think that might be the most intriguing thing to me about the work that you've been able to do in the field that you've been able to do it is the relationships you've been able to form with these, high level athletes and getting to know some of the inner workings of the business side of things. And now with NIL money in, NCAA sports, that the college game has very much become a business as well.
Yeah, 100%. And again, that's, mostly for the top athletes. I'm not sure, like, on these, like, D1 football teams or something, there's probably 100, 150 kids, right? So it's really 3 or 4 that are going to make the real money. But it is a little bit more like pro football now than it's ever been. And for some people, that change is super positive. And for old school guys like Nick Saban or whatever, they don't really love it because it's so much more of a business. But, there's always been the boosters and the other things that have been sort of behind the scenes that have always been there. And so now it's a little bit more upfront. The bigger programs, University of Texas or UGA or whatever it is, or Alabama, they need real money. They've always been super competitive, but now you need to pay these top guys, 2, 3, 4 million bucks a year in college or something. And it does give them options. They can stay longer. They don't have to get the shit kicked out of them on the Jets as a freaking 22-year-old rookie. I mean, and pretty much go there to freaking ruin your career. So there are some advantages, but for the most part, what we're really talking about is change, right? And I often say my wife is tied to young, bling, blang. All things change, right? And I'm always teaching people how to embrace change and to be more flexible, adaptive, creative, and resilient. And creativity, I always say, can be interpersonal because it's hard for me to draw even a stick figure. I'm not a musician like you. Although who knows? I mean, maybe I could write a song in the sense that I'm a deeper thinker, and I really respect that talent that you have. Songwriting is deeper.
I
For
can't
some
draw
random,
either,
yeah,
Dr. Brett. So
with for some random reason, I was just, coming across some of the history of, the Eagles, Glenn Fry and Don Henley and Joe Walsh and all that stuff. And I found that, because I grew up on that stuff, and I found it just absolutely fascinating. Hotel California, what it might have really been about, that song, about the excesses of Hollywood or the shallownesses of Hollywood and everything. And, there's different theories on different aspects of that song, but it was a deeper song than many, what I mean? And I grew up on like Billy Joel and Piano Man and shit like that. I just like the deeper, the deeper songwriting, right? The things that sort of wish you were here or something, right? Something that's a little bit more, deep and meaningful. And so I gravitate that way in terms of athletes too, the kids that work with me or the business people that work with me. It's got to be a fit at this stage. We got to really like each other, and then we're gonna develop a partnership for their personal growth. I just got somebody just reached out to me yesterday, and I could just intuitively vibe that I might like this guy. I can't prove it. It's just a little email. You know what I mean? But he's instantly calling me Brett instead of Dr. Brett, but he did it in a way that made me feel like, what I mean, we actually might really, connect here. And that's what I'm looking for at this stage of my journey. It's about it's not just, who you are or what you're about, but are we a fit at this stage of the journey? Does the energy match? And if it does, I always tell people they're going to win because I'm an all-in type. I'm like a football coach.
well, yeah, exactly. That connection is going to make you more effective at being able to help them. They're going to trust you more. You're going to, like you said, go all in on them. Not that you wouldn't
Exactly.
with someone prior in your career, but at 60 years old, right? You're
Yeah,
not doing stuff
totally.
for the money. You're doing it for the impact. And I
Well,
think
definitely
that
not
is,
in psychology anyway. Maybe in finance, but I'm not in finance, right? And I do a little bit of trading because that is the money game, and that is fun that way, right? So I'm sure you're doing other vehicles as well, right? Singing, songwriting, and however you're trying to monetize it. And they're not, they can be interconnected, but there is some separation as well.
yeah, well, and I need that, right? I need that
Yeah,
separation to still make things interesting to me and to stay in that flow of doing it. But yeah, everything's centered around entertainment and now just conversations. And that's what has been a blessing about today, getting to talk with you, Brett, and hear a little bit about your, journey and what you're doing out there to help, young athletes and business owners and the mental aspect of the game and the game of business as well, I think are so underrated and really not talked about enough in today's society. So appreciate you coming on and spending some time with me today.
awesome. Yeah. And one of the core aspects also about what I'm up to is I've got all these kids in like Europe and Australia and all over the world because I'm pushing them pretty hard to get out of their comfort zones. And you start in little ways by, maybe going to a coffee shop by yourself or something, or, grabbing a beer and talking to the bartender or the little old lady who sits down next to you. And then maybe traveling alone to like, the town over or some place that you always wanted to go, but I'm always pushing people to have experiences that help you get more comfortable in your own skin. You know what I mean? And then to get a little bit more, comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? Asking people out that you wouldn't normally ask out, or having conversations you wouldn't normally have. And my basic premise is, I mean, if you can't talk to a stranger or you can't ask a girl out, how the fuck are you going to hit 300?
Feel like that's a pretty solid analogy. Well, Brett, how can people get a hold of you if they want to work with you or find out more about what you do? Go ahead and plug whatever you need to or want to.
Just drbrettdenkin.com is the main website. We have several websites, and Ashley's got a whole bunch of things that we're working on here. But Dr. Brett Denkin, Denkin, Brett with two T's, .com. And then all my contact information is there.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your time. This was a great conversation, and I look forward to getting to have another one with you down the road.
All right. Sounds good, pal. Take care. See you, Bubba.